one of the most famous and powerful of the Greek polis, Sparta had a tremendous impact on Greek history during both the Archaic and Classical periods. However, despite being at the center of events for a couple of centuries and casting something of a spell on outsiders, the so-called Spartan mirage, the physical remains at Sparta are exceptionally limited. If a modern archaeologist with no knowledge of Greek history were to dig at Sparta, he or she could easily come away with the impression that Sparta was not a place of any particular importance, but rather something of an impoverished backwater. It most certainly was not a minor power, and interestingly enough, the historian Thucydides predicted that posterity might judge Sparta's power on its material remains and end up vastly underestimating both Sparta's power and importance. Today we explore what little there is to see at the site of this once great polis, and more importantly discuss why the material remains at Sparta are so minimal. The Peloponnese is effectively southern Greece, and this region is divided fairly neatly into different regions by the mountain ranges that are along the center of the Peloponnese. The southeastern portion of the Peloponnese is known as Lakonia, and this will be the home of Sparta. In the ancient sources, Sparta is typically called Lacedaemon, which is the name of the Spartan polis as a whole. And just as a reminder, the polis is something of a city-state. It is both a place, but also a political entity. So, in the sources, when you hear about the Lacedaemonians, that is a reference to the Spartans. The sources very rarely refer to the Spartans, but rather the Lacedaemonians. The inhabitants of Laconia writ large are referred to as either the Laconians or sometimes more politically as the Lacedaemonians. The term Spartan actually refers very specifically to full citizens of Sparta, known in Greek as Spartiates, but that is something that we will circle back to a little later. As for Sparta itself, it is the main settlement of the Lacedaemonians, and it is located on the central west bank of the Eurotas River, which runs through the center of Laconia. Let's begin by looking at the Bronze Age in Sparta. According to Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, both of which were written around the year 700 or so BCE, King Menelaos was the ruler of Sparta at the time of the Trojan War, and he was one of the most powerful monarchs in the Greek world. His brother was Agamemnon, who was king of Mycenae and more or less the overlord of the other Greek kings. Menelaos was hosting a delegation from Troy, which included the two princes Hector and Paris or Alexander, and his wife Helen, who was supposed to be the most beautiful woman in the world, happened to fall in love with young Paris/Alexander, who was an incredibly handsome prince, and so the two of them fell in love, and she absconded with the Trojan delegation back to Troy. Menelaos, rather than taking a new wife, complained to his brother Agamemnon, and together the two sons of Atreus vowed to gain their revenge on the Trojans, reclaim Helen, and punish the Trojans for their treachery, thus leading to the Trojan War, which lasted for 10 years. Now, because Sparta had very little in the way of Bronze Age remains, a lot of scholars assumed that Sparta was just kind of shoehorned into the story around the time that it was written because it had become important at that point, and so Homer, or whoever was recording the story, thought that Sparta must have more significance in the Greek past than it actually had. However, that picture is starting to change a little bit now, as we have learned that Sparta actually did have much more of a Bronze Age past than we previously realized. Up until 2008, scholars had found no real evidence of Mycenaean settlement in Laconia, and for that reason scholars assumed that this was something of a backwater in the Greek world, and perhaps it was not really developed enough to have a full-fledged palace culture. But all that changed in 2008 because that year archaeologists found a palace complex at Sparta, and it dated back to the Bronze Age. There was an excavation lasting from 2009 to 2015 at a site called Agios Vasileios, which is just to the west of Sparta. Now that the palace has been excavated and examined, it has become clear that it is very much a Mycenaean foundation and has all of the characteristic features and functions of a Mycenaean palace. It is on a smaller scale than the admittedly later palaces that we know of from Pylos and Mycenae, but it is very clearly Mycenaean and has all the features one would expect. I think they haven't found a megaron, though, which is something that is a very common feature of Mycenaean palaces, but that may be something that was not developed until a little bit later. We also know, interestingly enough, that not only is this a Mycenaean palace that we had never seen before, but also it is now one of our oldest Mycenaean palaces, including the oldest one to feature writing. The palace was both built and then burned to the ground during the 14th century BCE. Normally we think of this time as being sort of the peak of the Mycenaean civilization, but apparently it was not necessarily the peak for the prince at Sparta. The most important find at Agios Vasileios, however, is all of the Linear B tablets which were located there. Just like at many other sites where you had clay tablets, these tablets were preserved by the fire as they were baked and hardened. And so we found quite a few Linear B tablets, and this provides us with older samples of early Greek than we've seen before. And what it does show, because these tablets are older than anything we found before, is that perhaps the Greeks adopted Linear B earlier than we realized, and that it actually isn't that much newer than Linear A. There's also been some unearthing of Minoan remains in the vicinity of Sparta, which might indicate that there was a Minoan trading post in the area, and that might have spurred the growth of the local Mycenaean civilization as a response. So the developments that are going on in the region of Sparta are fairly interesting, even though we are working with some fairly scarce findings. But that should come as no surprise, given what I've already told you at the outset about the sparsity of Spartan remains in even the classical period. Famously, Sparta was a highly militaristic society once it emerges in the classical period. We've all seen 300 and other depictions of Sparta where it is this warrior society. The question is, how did it become that? And what we know from some literary fragments that we do have from the Archaic period is that Sparta was not always like that, but it must have become that way at some point in the Archaic period prior to the dawn of history as a written record, when Sparta was already this warrior state. Our main source of evidence that Sparta was something other than a warrior state at one point in its history comes to us from the poet Alkman. Alkman lived in the second half of the 7th century, so sometime between about 650 and 600. His poems are about subjects including the gods, praising and describing nature, and then discussing the beauty of women and his desire for them. So fairly typical poetic topics. Also, later Spartans would focus very heavily on being as laconic as possible, that is, speaking as little as they could. And, of course, you can see the origin of laconic. It comes from the word Lakonia. So if you've ever wondered where the word came from, now you know. But Alkman is certainly not laconic. He goes into significant detail on all kinds of different things that he describes in his poems, whether he's discussing the sound of waves crashing on the beach or the smell or look of a woman's hair, if he's interested in her. He goes into fabulous detail, and his poems became famous throughout the Greek world. In fact, his poems are so un-Spartan that earlier generations of scholars looked at them oddly and thought, well, Alkman can't be Spartan. He must be from somewhere else. This must be a false attribution. But in more recent years, most scholars are more of the opinion that he was sort of a pre-reform Spartan, that he's a Spartan before it became a warrior state, or perhaps even during the period when Sparta is transforming, but that he owes his survival to his poems being exported to other places in the Greek world. while Alkman was describing the beauty of the mountains around Sparta and trying to capture his love for various women in verse, there was another poet active in Sparta, and his name was Tyrtaios. The tradition is that the Spartans were struggling in their war with Mycenae, and they needed someone to stiffen their resolve. And so they turned to the oracle at Delphi, which recommended that they summon an Athenian named Tyrtaios. Tyrtaios came from Athens and tried to inspire the Spartans to greater deeds of valor. Tyrtaios' poems are purely military in nature. These are basically marching songs and poems which encourage men to be brave in the face of danger and to close the distance with their enemies and slay them in close combat. Tyrtaios' exhortations are very close in nature to what we think of as Spartan values as they existed during the classical period. And in fact, his poems would continue to be very popular in Sparta for many years to come. So popular, in fact, that they ended up surviving to the present in some cases because they were so closely associated with Sparta's fame and glory. The question that we should ask ourselves is how and why did Sparta choose the road of Tyrtaios over the road of Alkman? Why did they choose to become a militarized state rather than a more balanced state with multiple interests and priorities? Well, the answer seems to lie in the strains of the Second Mycenaean War. This was probably also the occasion which caused the Spartans to summon Tyrtaios to Sparta in the first place. At some point during that war, where the Spartans are trying to hold on to Messenia, which is an area to its west, which is separated by the mountains and can be hazardous to travel to and from during the winter, the Spartans decided that they needed to reform their institutions to create a better army which would be able to more easily hold on to this territory. And so, they underwent one of the most radical political transformations in ancient history. And this is a system that they set up that they referred to later as the Great Rhetra. The Spartans attribute this reform to a lawgiver named Lycurgus, who may or may not have actually been a real person. And Lycurgus created the Great Rhetra, which is effectively an oral constitution that citizens needed to memorize. In fact, this is not all that unusual for an ancient constitution to not be strictly written. We tend to think of constitutions today as written documents that have a clear definition of the forms of government. But in the ancient world, what they thought of as constitutions is a much broader idea, which can include social customs, and there is no expectation that these things will all be written down in the form of a statute. In Sparta, they take this to the extreme, and they never wrote down the Great Rhetra. What we do know about the Great Rhetra and Lycurgus and all of Sparta's other traditions and laws and everything else comes to us from outside writers who happen to live in Sparta at one point or another, or visit, or talk to Spartans here or there. But the Spartans themselves basically wrote nothing about what they were up to. And so every perspective that we have on Sparta is a fundamentally non-Spartan perspective. Most of the people who wrote about Sparta were Athenian aristocrats who admired Sparta, but ultimately were not themselves Spartan, and so might not have fully understood exactly what they were describing. I don't want to go through all of Sparta's many odd institutions, but I would like to give you a sense of a few of them, so that way you can see exactly why the Spartans cast such a mirage over the imaginations of their fellow Greeks. Suffice it to say that just about everything I'm about to tell you is something that is not something that pertains to any other Greek polis. So Sparta had a privileged body of around 10,000 full male citizens, this being the number that they had at their peak, who were able to devote themselves full-time to training for war and conducting war. These citizens were sustained by set allotments of land. So the land was artificially divided at some point in the deep past, and each full citizen would inherit a lot. And that lot would have workers on it and a certain amount of land, and it would produce enough food for the Spartan himself to eat, to feed his family, and also to not have to work. So he'd spend all his time at the barracks training for war and participating in Spartan politics at Sparta itself. The whole system was ultimately sustained by helots, and these are the former inhabitants of Messenia who were now effectively commonly owned slaves of Sparta. They would be the guys actually doing the manual labor on the various lots of land. And as if that weren't bad enough, we'll see that the helots are treated very poorly, which obviously creates more problems down the line. There was a third status of person, however, in Lakonia. And in the other Laconian towns, the ones on the coast and along the border with other areas of the Peloponnese, the residents were called the perioikoi, which means the dwellers round about. These are people who are not Spartan, but they're also not helots. They are effectively free men who don't have the rights of citizens, and their job is to do all of the crafts and trades that the Spartans don't do because they dedicated themselves to war. The perioikoi do fight alongside the Spartans in times of war, but they were considered to be inferior soldiers, and so they were more or less used to supplement the ranks of the Spartans, although the full Spartans would be the guys that the army would lean on when things would get hairy. So as if the helots didn't have it bad enough, Sparta actually had a ceremony each and every year where they would declare war on the helots. And rather than just being a symbolic thing, this was something that the Spartans actively pursued. Each year, they had a number of young men who were at the top of their graduating class from the education system called the agoge, and they would join what was known as the Cryptia, which is usually translated into English something like the secret police. And their job would be to wander around dressed as just average people, and they would carry with them a minimal amount of supplies and a knife, and what they would do is live off the land, and anytime they would encounter a helot who had wandered out after dark, they would enforce the curfew by murdering him. And then Sparta tried to keep the secret from the helots, that way they didn't know whether it was the Spartans doing it, or bandits, or what. And this was the way that they intimidated the helots, and for the most part were able to avoid helot revolts. Although helot revolts will happen in Spartan history, and were a constant threat, and caused the Spartans to have to hold back part of their army at any one time. Another interesting aspect of Spartan society is that unlike elsewhere in the Greek world, where women were often cloistered and expected to stay out of the public spotlight, at least women of the upper class who were of childbearing years, in Sparta, women were encouraged to practice sports and to really be physically active. And the reason for that is that the Spartans had a belief in eugenics. They thought that if women were more physically active, they would produce much more viable sons who would be better soldiers. And those are just a few of the many odd things that Sparta did. And I think it gives you an idea of why Sparta cast such a mirage on its neighbors. But I think it should also give you some idea of what the Spartans were doing rather than constructing grand architecture. Simply put, the Spartans had different priorities than the Athenians and other Greeks. The Athenians wanted to build the grandest architecture they could. The Spartans had very little interest in improving their city in that way. For the Spartans, to improve their city meant to train harder. It meant to spend more time working with the javelin and the spear, and wrestling and boxing. And because of that, there weren't many grand structures in Sparta. Let's take a look at Thucydides' Book 1, Chapter 10, Section 2, where he describes what you would see if you look at Sparta and then look at Athens. For I suppose if Lacedaemon were to become desolate, and the temples and the foundations of the public buildings were left, that as time went on, there would be a strong disposition with posterity to refuse to accept her fame as a true exponent of her power. And yet they occupy 2/5 of the Peloponnese, and lead the whole, not to speak of their numerous allies without. Still, as the city is neither built in a compact form, nor adorned with magnificent temples and public edifices, but composed of villages after the old fashion of Hellas, there would be an impression of inadequacy. Whereas if Athens were to suffer the same misfortune, I suppose that any inference from the appearance presented to the eye would make her power to have been twice as great as it is. So we see here in Thucydides that he is describing Sparta as a place where the Spartans didn't even bother to push their city together into one location. This is very odd. Elsewhere in the Greek world, it was very much common practice as communities would grow for them to relocate and build at a central spot. This was a process known as synoikism. At Sparta, however, there were several villages, and they weren't tightly connected. They also had no city wall, so most other cities would have a wall surrounding the entire city. Sparta said that they were defended by the bravery of their men. And because the Spartans were so singular in their focus, not only did they lack grand architecture, not only did they lack city walls and all the other amenities we normally associate with a Greek city, but also they didn't do literature. They only really had two poets in their history, really, and those guys were Alkman and Tyrtaios. After that point, the Spartans really quit engaging in the literary world. There are no Spartan historians. There are no Spartan philosophers. That's not an accident. This was intentional. And because the Spartans were so powerful, yet so non-materialistic, at least by the standards of the time, and because they said so little about themselves, this created a Spartan mirage. Other Greeks were fascinated by the Spartans, but they couldn't quite wrap their heads around them. And for later generations, including us, the deeds of the Spartans are fascinating. But we don't fully understand them. And when we study their institutions, so far as we know them, we become even more perplexed. So that is what it means to be taken by the Spartan mirage. Although another part of the mirage is really being swept away by it and really thinking that the Spartans are the greatest thing that ever happened. Which I don't think happens as often now as it used to. Because a lot of people read about Sparta's institutions and think that they're a little bit crazy. Just to put a little bit of visualization with what Thucydides was describing, what you see in orange is what Sparta held directly. This would be Messenia in the west, Lakonia in the east. What you see in pink are Spartan allies, known as the Peloponnesian League. Together, this represented the biggest power in the Greek world at this time, and it meant that Sparta was far and away the most powerful of the Polis. Athens was sometimes an ally, and so was Thebes, and they were the only two real rivals outside of the Peloponnese. Argos was the only rival internally, and if anything, I think Argos served as a useful foil, because Argos was much more of a threat to Sparta's allies, such as Corinth. So if anything, the threat of Argos served Sparta's purposes by allowing it to keep its allies loyal, since that those allies would need them. Unlike many imperial systems, however, Sparta in this early period did not extract any tribute from its allies. The only tribute they extracted was military service. They did not extract money. And also, the Spartans, being as soldierly as they were, did not construct any fancy meeting places when they would summon the Peloponnesian League leadership. So, holding this league meant that they didn't have any revenue with which to build any grand architecture to celebrate their successes, and also they didn't need any grand meeting places. By contrast, once the Athenians set up the Delian League, they take in a huge amount of revenue, and they use it to construct a lot of really impressive temples, including the Parthenon. So, that is a major difference. And yes, for those of you who want to be super pedantic about it, technically, the revenue of the empire did not build the Parthenon, but it did offset the naval expenses of Athens enough that they had enough money available to build the Parthenon. But at any rate, usually empire comes along with grand architecture just because you have a vast influx of wealth, and also you want to build structures that help you sustain that empire and help to impress outsiders. The Spartans only wanted to impress outsiders with their might. And this Peloponnesian League was capable of fielding armies between Sparta and its allies of up to 60,000 men at times, which by the standards of the day was massive. The only weakness that Sparta had, as I mentioned, were the Helots. And the reason the Helots were a potential weakness is because they were constantly looking for reasons to revolt. And if they were to revolt successfully and break away from Sparta, that would mean that the entire basis of Sparta's system would collapse. So because of that, Sparta wanted to be on good terms with its neighbors, so that way they would help them put down the Helots if it came to that. So Sparta in its early history was actually fairly just towards its neighbors, with a few exceptions, such as the Spartan interventions in Athens in the late 500s, where they tried to suppress the Athenian democracy in its early days. But for the most part, Sparta behaved with a fairly hands-off fashion towards its neighbors, and if anything, was the most reliable ally that anyone had. When we look at Sparta's strength, success, and stability, it is safe to say that Sparta peaked in the 5th century. Sparta then led a very strong Peloponnesian League. During the Persian Wars, Sparta was at the head of the Greek coalition which drove off the Persian Empire. The Spartans famously fought at first Thermopylae and then Plataea, and they also led the fleet. Even though Sparta didn't contribute many ships, still the Spartans would always serve as the supreme commanders of all of the various allied armies and navies. Sparta viewed itself as the upholder of Greek liberty, and this put them at odds with Athens, which they like to characterize as a tyrannical power. Athens developed a little empire after the Persian Wars and began to extract money from its allies. So, although Athens was a democracy and Sparta had a system of state slavery, still most Greeks felt that Athens was a greater threat to their own freedom than Sparta, and so they looked to Sparta as a beacon of hope and a source of potential liberation. Eventually, tensions between Athens and Sparta resulted in the Peloponnesian War breaking out in 431, and in the end, after a long back-and-forth struggle, Sparta emerged victorious and became the hegemon of the entire Greek world. You might think this would be the peak of Sparta, but in fact, this was a poison pill. Sparta was simply not set up to handle an empire, as we'll see. To put it as succinctly as possible, Sparta was not capable of managing an empire which extended outside of the Peloponnese. There were some serious problems from the outset. Due to both casualties in war and growing inequality, the Spartan citizen body was shrinking. The overall population was probably about the same, if not a little bigger, but there were no longer 10,000 full citizens. In fact, by 371, after the losses at the Battle of Leuctra, there would only be 1,000 full male citizens. And this is because Sparta was not fully enforcing the Great Rhetra and making sure that there were 10,000 men who were fully sustained by lots. And this is at a time, keep in mind, where you need a lot of full male citizens around to serve as officers, now that Sparta is trying to govern a lot of various cities around Greece. And this also means, of course, that at home you have a lot of discontent, as there are men who are kind of half-citizens. So Sparta starts creating all kinds of odd statuses to describe people who are citizens by birth but don't technically have enough money to be full citizens. So things are spiraling out of control at home. You have more problems than just the Helots now. And also, you have not enough officers to go around. The Spartans began to behave arrogantly as well. Rather than liberate the Greeks as they had promised, they instead installed dictators and small oligarchies around the Greek world to extract wealth from those places the same way the Athenians had. Although the Athenians set up democracies to do so, but similar system. Because of this, Sparta now had more enemies than ever, and many of their once loyal allies, including Corinth, became discontent. Within a decade, due to Persian gold, Sparta lost control of its holdings in Asia and northern Greece, so most of what it gained in the Peloponnesian War was lost within a decade. And also, even Athens started to make a recovery around this time, after having been defeated and nearly destroyed by Sparta. And then, for the next 20 years, the Spartans would remain dominant, even if it was more localized. Their fleet had been completely destroyed already, but on land they were still exercising their power very vigorously. Then in 371, Sparta's hold on central Greece was smashed to bits by the Thebans at the Battle of Leuctra. And this is the point where the Spartans realized that they only had 1,000 male citizens, where they had once had 10,000 going into the Persian Wars. After this victory, the Thebans follow up, and they managed to liberate Messenia, thus depriving Sparta of the area which gave the Spartans their wealth and their leisure. The Spartans would continue to try to hang on to their system, but it was a losing battle. They also would continue to try to reconquer Messenia and challenge other powers for dominance, but these efforts were not successful. The most famous effort was when the Spartans challenged Macedon in 330 by themselves and lost to the regent Antipater. So Sparta, from now on, will be quite a bit weaker. During the Hellenistic period, the problem that Sparta faced is that it was effectively a classical polis competing in a post-classical world. After the classical period, the new standard system of organization was either a kingdom or a league, two forms of government which would enable the amassing of greater material resources and greater manpower. Sparta was internally divided as they tried to keep the Great Rhetra going, but the forces against reform were super strong as well, and so most of Sparta's conflicts were internal, but once in a while they would unite together and then try to fight an outside power. When they did so, they found that Sparta was no longer strong enough to really pose an existential threat to their enemies. Sparta could come out and win a battle or two, but ultimately they just didn't have the manpower or resources to defeat the Achaean League or any of their other rivals. And as a result of their diminished stature, the Spartans decided that for the first time in their history they could no longer depend just on the valor of the Spartan soldiers, but instead would need to construct city walls to keep themselves safe. So reluctantly, Sparta constructed a city wall for the first time. We still have parts of this today, by the way. Spartan politics continued to be very unstable. Kings were frequently deposed and murdered, and eventually the two dynasties that had ruled Sparta for its entire history, and yes, that was one of the other weird institutions of Sparta, they had two dynasties at once. These were both overthrown, and a tyrant named Nabis emerged as the winner, and he built up an army and led it against the Romans, only to be defeated in 192, and after that point, Sparta ceased to be independent. However, its history, especially its archaeological history, was not over. During the Roman period, Sparta actually saw its greatest spate of building activities. The Romans were as fascinated by the Spartans as the other Greeks had been, but their interest went a bit deeper. Rather than simply speculating about the Spartans from afar, the Romans decided to get an up-close and personal view. So effectively what they did is they began to subsidize the Spartan lifestyle. Now all of the inhabitants of Sparta engaged in the old ways of the agoge, which is the Spartan training system. So effectively, they prepared for war as if they were still living in the classical period, and they did so on the understanding that the Romans would give them money to do so. The Romans then built up a bunch of infrastructure to visit the city and watch as all this is going on. So the Romans would effectively wander about and just watch the young Spartans train for war, and watch the women play sports, and watch the various competitions that they would engage in. So this was a very odd arrangement, but it's kind of fitting given exactly how weird Sparta is. If we think about the Romans, I mean, these are the same people who love gladiatorial contests. So what is there not to love about the Spartans? After all, each graduating class of the agoge, when the young men are 18, not only will some of them go off and kill helots, obviously that had to be abandoned after Roman conquest, but one of the other institutions that they had for young men is they'd take their 7 finest young men and have them play King of the Mountain on Sparta's greatest temple, and whoever was the winner would be the last guy standing at the top of the stairs. So they took their finest young men and threw them down a bunch of marble stairs. Sounds smart to me. But at any rate, this was something the Romans wanted to watch. And the Spartans were willing to oblige. This enabled them to continue their ancestral traditions, and it gave the Romans something that they could go watch. So, eventually, of course, Rome declined, and this system broke down. Later on, the area had been largely abandoned, but the Byzantines resettled it with a settlement at Mistras, which included a lot of church buildings which have survived. And then the modern Greek government decided to refound a city of Sparta, which currently has about 30 to 35,000 people, and it is located right next to the ancient remains of Sparta. So, you actually can go to Sparta today, but there has been quite a bit of discontinuity from the ancient city. However, if you were to visit the place, you could easily walk right outside of town and visit the sparse remains of one of the greatest powers in the history of the classical world. So that is all I have for you now on Sparta. Perhaps in the future I will revisit the topic of Sparta and go through some of its odd institutions in greater detail.